Welcome to Topics of Interest. I'm Dr. Jerry Lewis, and today I'm talking with Dr. Robert Zibbell. We're going to be discussing report writing. As a disclaimer, it's important to mention that what gets discussed here is not representative of Magel, but rather Bob's opinions, perhaps some of my opinions and my questions. First question I'd like to know, Bob, is what is the actual purpose or goal of a GAL report?
Probably the main purpose of the report is to provide as much information to the court about the questions it wants answered. The information has to be about topics that are relevant to the questions that they want, because people give you all kinds of information. And part of the job of the GAL when they're writing is to sort through this and pick out those aspects of all that amount of information that's the most relevant. In addition to which, the information should come from sources that are reliable, in the sense that it's not simply just he said, she said, which you may write down just to make sure everybody's perspectives are there in the report, but that you want information that somehow you can corroborate, whether you have seen it yourself by observing parents and children together, whether you have heard it from collateral sources of information, or whether there's some kind of documentation, whether it's affidavits, supporting documents that either corroborate or disconfirm information that one or another of the parties has given you. So that's the sort of main purpose of the report. Sort of a secondary purpose can be when the court asks you to consider specific issues, such as whether it's substance abuse or mental illness. Then the goal of the GAL report and the goal of the GAL evaluation or investigation is to explore those issues and to provide information relevant to those particular questions in the same way that you would the other kinds of issues having to do with parenting in general.
How would you say, for the clinicians out there, how is a GAL report different, say, a clinical evaluation report? Can you comment on that?
Different from an investigation?
No. A GAL report, how is a GAL report different from, I've done an evaluation on a person and I'm writing a clinical report? Is that worth going into?
It is if you're a clinician, particularly if you're a clinician that is new to the field of forensic psychology or forensic mental health, because in the leading up to this, you may have done a lot of clinical evaluations, which may have to do with simply doing family histories, doing mental status examinations. If you're a psychologist, you may have added psychological testing to that, whether it's in a hospital or it's in an office. And the difference is, for the most part, with those kinds of evaluations, you're getting information directly from the client or the patient, as the case may be. Occasionally, you may involve family members to give you more information about the functioning of that person that you're evaluating. But with a forensic evaluation, you're getting information from multiple sources. You're getting them from the clients themselves, you're getting them from documentation, you're getting information from collateral sources of information, and you're doing a whole bunch of different kinds of observations that you might not do in terms of multiple parties together, parents and children, that you might not do in a clinical assessment.
Okay, that's helpful. Because being a clinician, I've written millions of reports, but you know, because I've actually gone to you sometimes, it's a different style of writing. To me, it's a different style of report writing.
The other thing in clinical reports is two issues come to mind. One is that, as it is with this report, people can sometimes devolve into a kind of clinical jargon that they write in. Because they're writing for other clinicians, or they're writing for a psychiatrist who wants an evaluation, or what have you. And so those reports will have this kind of highfalutin professional language in it that forensic reports really shouldn't have.
So we've sort of covered it. The intended audience or readers of this report are?
Okay. Well, actually, there's several audiences. There's a group of audiences that are considered to be the audiences that are intentional. So one would think that the most important audience is the court,
the judge,
because this is, in every case, when one writes a report or does an evaluation, the GAL should do it with the idea in mind that this has some likelihood of ending up in a trial. In actual practice, that's rarely the case. I mean, less than 10% of your cases will end up in trial. But nonetheless, you should write it with that in mind, because that's the ultimate way that you'll be tested. The second audience, and the people who are most likely to read it, will be the attorneys, assuming there are two attorneys on a case. And in many GL cases, there are two attorneys, unless you're taking a state pay case, and it's more likely they'll be pro se, they'll be representing themselves for this evaluation. So the attorneys will always vet the report, and the good ones will make extensive notes on it, with the idea that they may have further questions, which they may want to explore in a deposition, or they may in a trial. The other important audience for this are the parties themselves.
Yes.
And the part of the conflict in writing a report, where you know the parties will read it, and they very well should read it, it's about them, is how much information to include from what they have told you into the report. You want to have enough information in there so that they know that they've been heard, that you've taken down the important information. On the other hand, you're having to make judgments in the end about what information is relevant to the questions that the court wants to know. That may not always be the information that they think is relevant. So you have to do a bit of a sorting, but you have to put enough in so that they feel, first off, they're paying for it, that they have been heard by the GAL. They may not agree with your conclusions or your recommendations in the end, but at least on paper it shows that you were listening, you were taking notice. So those are the intended audiences. There's a group of unintentional audiences that you don't always think about writing for. And in many of these cases, whether they have been settled between the parties, or between the parties and the attorneys, or they've gone to trial, there are other professionals who may be involved during or after the case. So there may be therapists involved who are working with the kids or working with the family. There may be parenting coordinators who get recommended as part of the outcome of the particular dispute, for whom reading the report would be very useful in understanding the parties, understanding the kinds of issues they brought to the table and that they were in dispute, and getting a sense of how these folks might function together as a post-divorce couple for the PC's purposes. One more. The last one would have to do with, sometimes there'll be court mediators involved. People will go to mediation, and you'll find in some settlement agreements that parties are expected to go to mediation before they bring a case back to court. They don't have to do that, but it's written into the agreement. It's sort of a value for them to do that, so to avoid great expense and see if the cases can be resolved. But it may be helpful for mediators or conciliators to read this report if it's relevant to their work with the parties after the divorce.
What's happened with some of the cases that I've been involved with, there was an earlier GAL 3 or 4 years ago.
Okay.
And now it's going back, and I'm been assigned. So I get to read the report. I mean, the attorneys get it, they get permission, they give it to me. So that's another intended or unintended.
That would be unintended, because I think when I'm writing a report, in the past, I've always felt like, well, this is going to be the report that's going to help resolve the case in whatever way it turns out. I don't think of it as, well, another GL is going to read this. For me, it's, the important people are the parties, the attorneys, and the court in the end.
So how can the courts now are really saying, make your reports shorter, make them more relevant? How can a GAL make the report more useful for a reader? What can we do?
Well, I mean, reports, let's back up a little bit.
Okay.
One of my experiences after I stopped being a GAL was that I was asked, along with 2 other clinicians, GALs, to read about 45 reports apiece. About a couple of years ago, when they were recertifying GALs. And in doing that, I read reports that weren't anywhere from 15 to 18 pages to those that were over 100 pages.
Wow.
My sense was that the reports that were under 20 pages didn't give you enough information to really know what was going on in this situation. The reports that were 100 pages gave you too much information.
So you got to thread that needle.
Well, the problem is, it's easy to say you should look for a happy medium.
Yeah.
The difficulty as an evaluator is that and as judges and lawyers will tell you, these cases are fact specific, right? So they come one at a time. Each one is unique in its own way. And there may be oodles of documents. There may be, a plethora of collaterals that they want you to talk about, and professional collaterals, not the ones where the court says you can only talk to 2 or 3 people who are relatives or friends, but the professionals are the ones who have, at least on the surface, no particular interest in the outcome of the case, that their information may be the most relevant. The other thing that's it's kind of like, what is it, Occam's razor. How do you slice something so that you can divide the information that for you that's the most relevant kind of information from the stuff that's less relevant. So that's the sort of art of writing a report, and the art of investigating or evaluating a case is it's like the fulcrum. So you want it to bend on the side of the relevant information.
Yes.
If it's a case with a very complicated fact pattern where there's been sexual abuse allegations or substance abuse allegations,
then you have to go into
there's a lot more information that you have to gather, and so the case, in a sense, drives the amount of information that you're going to get. That said, the longer cases, the longer reports tend to put in lots of different kinds of family history, lots of information that may be extraneous to the particular issue that the court wants. So that's one aspect of it. And there's always a conflict of how much you're going to write.
Let me just ask you on that, because I think I did run this by you one time. If it's been ongoing and there's other documents that have all sorts of history, like an earlier GAL report, or a court document that goes through all of the marriage and what went on, do we need to repeat that, or can we have a sentence that says, given that this information can be found in other documents, I'm going to very briefly describe the history of the marriage, or leave out the psychosocial data of the 2 parties? Do you follow my question?
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think if the information is
someplace
reasonably available elsewhere.
Yeah.
For instance, if it's a prior GL report, and the court already has access to that, and the lawyers may have access to that,
Yes.
Then I think you can leave out most of that information. You can reference it in some way, and you can also simplify family history, marital history, particularly if there's nothing jumps out at you as red flags that may, in the end, be relevant to the questions the court wants. For the most part, early family histories, unless it's dramatic trauma, you can pretty much simplify that in a paragraph or 2 without going on in a whole page kind of thing. I think that the only other thing that's important in report writing, in terms of the purpose of the report, is whether the court has asked you for recommendations. It may be that the court just wants you to provide all the relevant information, doesn't want to set a recommendation, in which case your job is a little simpler, because then you're just a fact gatherer kind of thing. But if the court, and I think at least my experience has been that it's more often than not the court wants to set they sort of want to know what conclusions you come to. What do you think, and why do you think it?
Therein lies the difference between E and an F?
Not necessarily. No, because I've talked to lawyers who do this and do investigations, and it seems to me that fairly often they're asked for recommendations also. The catch is in the standards that we have to sort of live by, the state standards. There's some discouragement, or maybe even prohibition, for them from coming to a set of conclusions, doing any particular analysis of the data. But how can you make a recommendation if you haven't taken the data and done some kind of middle step where you analyze what this data means, and then it's then relevant to the conclusions themselves and the recommendations? That's
one of the things that you've told me is, if you're going to make recommendations in the body of the report, somewhere there has to be something that backs up that recommendation. You just can't go out there on a limb. There has to be something of relevance.
Right. There has to be a link between the data that you collected, the information you collected, and your understanding of what that means relevant to the questions the court has asked, for instance, like parenting ability. And then that link logically to the recommendations you should make. You should be able to engineer backwards from the recommendations to the rationale to the data.
Going backwards. Okay.
Somebody should be able to look at that and see clearly the chain of logic.
Yeah.
Your, what your thinking is and why you thought it.
All right. What are mistakes people make in the reports? You said that you read through 45 of them, and other people, you talked about the length. 18 to 20 pages is too short, 100 pages is too long. But what are some other mistakes that people make in report writing?
Well, from reading a lot of these reports, one problem that you come across, that I came across, and I think my fellow readers did, was that the reports were poorly organized. One of the keys to having a readable report is that you have a really good structure to it, so that and it doesn't have. Everybody doesn't have to have the same structure, but it should be somewhere in there that it's clear. First off, you have to be able to identify everybody. There were a number of reports it wasn't clear who the children were, what their names were, what their ages were.
Okay.
Even if you went back to the original paragraphs, it was hard to find. So there ought to be some initial explanation of who the main characters are, the children, their ages, what they do necessarily. And also there needs to be some pretty clear delineation of what you did as a GAL, as an investigator evaluator.
How you spent all your time.
Yeah, who you talked to, how long you spent talking with them, what's the sequence in which you did that, mom, dad, kid, whatever it might be. When you talked to the collaterals, how long you spent talking to them and so forth, and in what order you did for that matter too. So that kind of organization gives the reader a sense of this is how you went about the investigation or the evaluation. Then you should have also some good organization in terms of the topics that you're going to write about, whether it has to do with parent A or parent B, about the children, about the relationship between each parent and each child kind of thing, and a section by itself on the collaterals, each collateral described what they said and so forth, and then any particular documentation that you should have. One of the mistakes that people made in the course of writing all this information down, when they were asked to make recommendations to come to some kind of opinion, was that two things. One is that you would see people writing opinions in the body of the data itself, the data not at the data analysis, but in the body of the collection of the data. Opinions and recommendations need to be totally separate from the data that's collected.
So the first part is just the facts, ma'am, just the facts.
Just the facts, ma'am, that's right.
And then you move to an analysis of it, and based on that, then there's recommendations.
Right.
What I found difficult is, do you need to, because I've seen some reports, list every single document that you read that was given to you by both attorneys? I mean, I have a stack of documents on one case like this, but in the report I have to type up every single thing I read?
Well,
or can I just say, got a whole bunch of documents here from the courts?
That's actually a difficult question, because I think it may relate more to the style in which you write the report than any particular rule or regulation about it. So it's the individual differences.
Because you listed, I've seen it.
Well, I only list the documents that I used.
That you read or that you used?
That I used.
Okay.
You may get a slew of documents and you may peruse a bunch of these things or scan them because most of them may not be relevant.
Yeah.
And you may pick the one, like for instance, if I always read the affidavits, because the affidavits were supplemental to what the parties were telling you themselves, and I always included the essence of what the affidavit said, particularly if there was information in the affidavit that I didn't get from the party. I would always ask the party if I had the affidavit, but I would include it in the description of the affidavit, that document. Documents from schools, document from physicians, therapists. If I used them and I summarized them and I put them in there. If I read documents that you can, like you said, you can get reams of this stuff.
So you won't list every single...
No, I don't. I have seen reports that do that.
I know, it's torture.
It takes up a lot of space.
Yes, a lot of time.
And so, but if it's not relevant, see, it's again, it hinges on what's relevant, it seems to me. So if the documents I use I include, it's because they're relevant, and they'll be included.
How about emails from the parties? I've had people bring in emails, pictures. Here, look at this, look at these emails. How do you handle those?
Well, probably what I would do is in the document listing section, I would say multiple emails from each party over this period of time.
Right.
If there were emails that I used
Yes.
because they were related to something that one party said about the other, there was some kind of corroboration in those emails about what was supposed to have happened, then I will list that email, because in that email I may also write a little summary of what that email was about, like I would with a affidavit or a document from a physician or something like that.
So you do. So you don't only put in, I read the affidavit, I did not know this, but you summarize what the affidavit actually said, or what the emails said.
Right.
Okay. Well,
Because it's again, here's the question of whether you want to write your report at a greater length, or you want to make it shorter. If you want to shorten those reports, you can simply leave those things out. You just say, these emails, those documents. You don't even have to put a summary there.
You don't have
and
to.
let somebody ask you about them. But for me, it seems to me that the nature of the evaluation, the things that you considered, the information that was most relevant ought to be transparent. The reader ought to know, oh yeah, he read this, he read that, he didn't read that. Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
But it should all be there. That makes for a longer report,
Yeah.
but the foundation for what you ultimately recommend is all contained. 99% of it is contained in those pages.
So, having an organization to the report is important. Not putting your opinions, recommendations into the beginning part, which is just the facts, saving that for the end. The third part is that whatever recommendations you're making, you ought to have been able to, trace the breadcrumbs from the facts to the recommendation, or from the recommendation back to the information that's in your report. You just can't wing it and say, oh, I recommend this, when there's nothing in the report that has relevance for that. Okay.
Other things that we found in these reports were, I guess you'd call them sloppy writing.
Yeah.
Typos, spelling error. I mean, there's spell check, but the problem with spell check is it doesn't pick up homonyms.
Yes.
And so you need to go back and you need to read it. The problem with writing a report and editing a report, if you're somewhat conscientious about this, first off, it takes a long period of time, and clearly most people don't get paid for all the time they put into writing reports.
Right.
It probably takes twice as long as you actually get paid for. But after you've edited something once and you go back and look at it, you stop seeing your own mistakes.
Right.
Particularly with homonyms, you just go right over them. And so it's really helpful, particularly if you're in the first year or two of doing this stuff, to have somebody else read the report.
Yeah.
And because they'll pick up errors that you won't even see anymore. And so that's a useful thing to do. And if you're in a peer group, or if you're in a consultation relationship with somebody, they'll read your report, you'll read their report, and you'll each pick up each other's mistakes.
That's a good point. Does it have to be another professional? Could it be, I used to, before, have my secretary read my psychological reports? Because she was great. So it could be a secretary, could it be a spouse, could it be a friend, or do you think it needs to be someone in the field?
I think it depends on why you want them to read the report.
Just typos.
Okay, if you just want it for editorial kinds of things, then I think as long as that person understands that there's a vow of confidentiality that comes with reading this stuff, because it's private material. And the only caveat I would have about that is whether the parties should know. See, in my because of the issue of confidentiality, in my memorandum of agreement, that the contract that people would sign, I always put a statement in there, and I reserved the right, because it was a professional obligation, to have another professional read the report in a consultation manner. And then if I had any questions about the material, I had the right to ask for consultation. So that there was always that part was transparent, that there may be somebody else reading my report. So my spouse never read my report. I'm trying to think, the only people who read my report were other professionals.
Yeah. Okay.
But it may be that you have a secretary who's just got a great eye.
Yes.
And you then, I think you're bound to say, look, when I write my report, I don't catch all my mistakes. My secretary, who's bound by the same confidentiality I am, is gonna review this and pick up all the typos.
Because
of them.
editors are amazing. I mean, I've written some books, and the people don't know anything about the content, but they know how to go through it
Right.
and see typos and organize it.
Right.
So, you and I've consulted with you on cases. Does that need to be in the report? That if I've talked to you about a case, or anyone about a case, do I need to include that? Because then there's, I've heard it come up that then that person, and if I've been deposed and they've asked me, have you talked to anyone or discussed this case with anyone? How do you handle that?
I didn't put it in the report. I've never done that. If I'm asked whether I have consulted with anybody, I just say yes. If they say who, I say who.
Okay.
It's no big deal. I don't know that.
Is there any liability for that person?
Well, that person, if you're getting, for instance, if you're consulting with me and you're paying me,
Yes.
right? So there's a professional consultation relationship. So my responsibility is just to keep notes about the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And then if I get asked, at least I have some documents to show what we did. And that's probably what a professional consultant should do. If it's just in a peer group, you're reading each other's reports, I don't think that you're required to do that at all.
Okay. All right, that's really
But that's
helpful.
just, like I said, that's just my opinion.
Well, that's what we're talking about. This is topics of interest. Bob, we're going to close in just a little bit. But is there anything else that would be really important for people to know when they're starting to write or continuing to write these kind of reports?
Okay, so I think of two issues.
Go ahead.
Not just one. One has to do with just a style of writing, and that, from reading a lot of reports, is the nature of what goes into it, simply what goes into a paragraph. I know that sounds very elementary, but time and time again reading these reports, I found that people would write extensively long paragraphs, sometimes half a page, single-spaced. What they taught you in middle school about paragraph writing is that it
What
really
if you
should.
weren't paying attention?
Well, maybe not, but it should cover one topic.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
It can be lengthy, but if you stick to one topic, if there's something else that's in that paragraph that's not related to that topic, make another paragraph.
Yeah.
So I have, in reviewing people's reports, and I've done this with when I've read people's reports as a consultant, looking at a paragraph, and I'll say this paragraph is simply overly long.
Right.
Cut it into 2 or 3 paragraphs
To
because
run
there's
on
multiple
paragraph.
issues dealing in the same paragraph.
Mhm.
It's very confusing to read. It's arduous for the reader to stay focused as to the issues that you're trying to convey. So simpler is better. If you have to make extra paragraphs, do that. The other thing that's interesting is that if you're writing in Microsoft Word, as most people are,
Mhm.
some people use Google Docs, but Microsoft Word is still the gold standard. It has something called a readability quotient.
Oh,
I
yeah.
can't tell you here how to do that, but you can go on Google and say, how do you do the readability quotient?
Sure.
And what that tells you is the reading level at which you are writing. And most of us will write, if you did this readability quotient, probably about a 12th grade reading level, which means 12th grade and up. It doesn't go higher than that.
Right.
What I took as my standard was the reading level that was expected for people taking the MMPI, which was the 8th grade reading level.
Oh, okay.
Right?
I've heard
So
you
it
talk
is-
about this
It
before.
is really difficult to. It's not so much dumbing down your report writing as it is writing in, first off, plain English,
Yep.
not using multiple syllabic words, not writing complicated sentences, writing in the active voice, and then doing a readability quotient. And it took me several years to go from the 12th grade level to the 10th grade level until I finally graduated to the 8th grade level. It was like an achievement to be able to do that. But the writing is clearer. The writing is in the active voice. It's a much more energetic kind of writing. It's easier to read.
When you say active voice, can you explain what that means?
Well, for instance, if you're doing an observation and you see something going on between, let's say, a parent and a child, and you can say, Johnny was handed the toy by his father. Well, that puts that sentence in the passive voice. Simpler to say, Johnny's dad handed him the toy.
Okay.
It's a much more energetic sentence. It's
Yeah.
easier to read. It gets the point across much more simply. And it lowers the readability quotient, just makes it, again, you're doing a lot of work, writing these reports, you know, and making them as clear as you can. Your job is to try to make it as easy as you can on the reader, because you want them to understand, and particularly the three audiences that are reading this, the primary audiences, the court, the lawyers, and the parties, so that they understand what you're getting at. In addition to which, if you've written a really good, clear report, you'll get another referral.
Yeah. So let's get down to something even this is maybe more basic. When you write a report, well, two things I have a question. Do you refer to the mother, the father? Do you refer to Ms. So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so? Mother and father would make it easier. Then I have to remember who's Ms. So-and-so or who's Mr. So-and-so. So do you identify them by their pronoun of what their role is to this child, or by their name?
I always refer to them by their name. For me, it was a matter of, at least the way I thought about it, was a matter of showing respect for them.
Mr. So-and-so,
Ms. So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so. And the way I did that basically was using their initials, unless, God forbid, their initials were exactly the same. And then you do search and replace by putting their names in. It just covers the whole report in one fell swoop. So it was easy if it was John Jones, it was JJ. You know, if it was Harriet Jones, it was HJ.
Right.
And then you just
you could go in,
fill that in at the end, kind of thing.
I've also noticed on your report template, which is the one that I use, you have it, you know, numbers down the side.
Yes.
The line numbers, double space or space and a half.
Space 1 point. Well, I've done space and a half. What I ended up doing was because Word gives you 1.15.
Yeah.
So there's enough little space. Because I have read reports that are very dense, that are single spaced.
Yeah.
Your eyes get tired really quickly. They're really hard to read. So it's hard to focus. So you want to make it easier. Some people will write space and a half, and sometimes double space, because it allows people to write in between the lines who are reading your report.
Yes.
That kind of, so it makes it easier. The other thing I do is I do line number all my reports.
Right, I see.
Each page starts 1 to whatever, 30, and then it starts over again.
Yeah.
The reason for that is, again, trying to make it easier for the reader, and particularly the reader who is an attorney, because if it's likely that you're going to get deposed or cross-examined, it's so much easier for them to say,
page.
They'll say, Dr. Zibbell, you know, you wrote da-da-da-da on page 7. And I'll say, well, look, can you tell me what line?
Right.
And they will look at the line, and after a while, they get the message, and they'll say, Dr. Zibbell, on page 27, line 7, you wrote. I can go directly to that. You don't have to waste time looking for where the heck is that in the paragraph.
Yeah.
It's just easier for them. It makes you it's much less anxious, because you don't have to go searching in this dense report for the information that they want to question you about. So it's a service to them, but ultimately it's a service to yourself.
Listen, thank you really very much. This has been helpful for me. I've learned a few things, and I've talked to you a lot about report writing. I hope that this is helpful to Magel members who might be viewing this. Again, let me say, this is Bob's opinion on things. Over how many years you've been doing this?
I say, when I stopped, it was 33 years and 500 cases.
Okay, 33
Over
years
500.
and 500. I think he has his street cred with that. But this does represent his views, not the views of Magel. Thanks a lot, Bob.
Thank you for asking me.